that? You gonna get it? Get it. Welcome back to part 4 of building a Ragebringer. Last week we started with the socketing of the guard and the pommel. This week we're going to do the profiling and finish shaping on that. So here we go. The socket we milled last week is below this line, so when we glue our profiling pattern on, we need to make sure we get it completely below that line so our socket will go all the way through. This is quite a bit of material to remove, and normally you would want to cut that out, but this bronze stock is soft enough that if we step down to a 36 grit belt, we can actually grind that out pretty quickly, as well as addressing the rest of the profile. Once we get this profile roughly ground out, you'll see that we haven't actually broken through into the socket yet. So we're going to do that last little bit by hand so that we don't have to alter the profile. To do that, we're going to use a rotary tool with a sanding drum on it, and we'll just kind of use the edge of that drum right where that socket is until we break through. Once we do break through, we will swap over to hand files so that we can be a little bit more precise about what we're cutting. Once we get that opened up and try to seat the blade, you'll see that it still doesn't quite fit, and that's because the tang has a taper on it, but the socket is straight. You'll also see how that center line that we scribed on the guard and the tang will help us keep the blade centered while we try to symmetrically file that matching taper into the guard. Let's take a quick detour and talk about the geometry of the blade itself, specifically where the ricasso meets the tang. You might be inclined to put a sharp corner there, but that would actually cause a stress riser that would crack. So instead, we actually put a small gentle curve there, and that spreads those forces out to reduce the chance of a crack. That means we need to grind an opposing curve into the guard so the blade can actually seat. To do that, we seat the blade as best we can, and then we trace around the shape of the blade where it meets the guard. And then we can use hand files to come in and file at an angle to remove that and give a little bit of a curve there. If you look really closely, maybe even pause the video when we seat the blade in, you'll see how the negative curve we're grinding here will meet up to the positive curve on the blade itself. Once we got that blade sitting really snugly into the guard, I took it back over to the belt grinder and I cleaned up the faces with some 220 grit sandpaper. And I also did an initial beveling on the quillions just to remove some of that weight. And I kind of wanted to get a preview of what this thing is going to look like. The geometry of the blade where the pommel sits is the same as where the guard sits. So there's a small taper, and the shoulder also has that same gentle curve. So the filing that we need to do for the pommel is pretty much the same filing that we just did on the guard. You're about to see me test fit the pommel onto the tang, and when I do that, you'll get a good glimpse of why I taper the tang. I have to squeeze the tang into the pommel here, and that's because of those tapers. That makes for a really positive, tight fit, kind of like a door stopper under a door. And that means that when we do our final fit up, this pommel will fit really snug on there, and we don't have to worry about it coming loose or making rattling noises when you use it. In the case of the pommel, I chose to socket it first and then profile it after. And I did that so that if I got the socket a little crooked and the pommel was sitting a little cattywampus on the blade, I could actually grind that mistake out by just rotating the pattern on the pommel. And once we get that profile set in, we have nice clean faces that we can paint up with some marking fluid and start scribing in our diamond cross section that we want. There's no grinding jig for this part, so you just kind of freehand grind until you hit your layout lines. There really isn't a plan for the peen block yet, so for that I just kind of freehand grind it until I'm happy with the shape. I'm dipping it in water frequently because the small parts get hot really quick when you're sanding on them. Now we've got all three pieces of our hardware all roughed out, so I can't resist doing a test fit. I love this shot here. This was the first time I really felt like I was holding a dagger. But that's not the end of it, so we're going to get straight into finishing those parts up, putting a high grit finish on it. We are still shaping and not polishing, but we're going to go with a 400 grit structured abrasive because we want nice soft rounded edges and not sharp lines. If we went with a lower grit belt, we'd be more apt to get facets, which we would just have to sand out later. Using this unsupported portion of the belt, the so-called slack belt, also helps us get those nice soft lines that we're after. That takes us about as far as we can go with the quick operations this week. I'll let you get a little bit of a preview of the tedious, boring hand sanding that we have to do to get all of these polished up. This is exactly what it sounds like it is. You're sanding the blade and the parts by hand, and you do that with a sanding block or just with your fingers. And you start with the lowest grit sanding paper, maybe 120, and you use that to remove all the grinder marks. Once that's done, you step up to 220, and you just keep going up from there until you get to the finish you want. This is an interesting shot here. It shows how I've put small little dimples on the blade and the hardware so that I know that I'm putting them on facing the right direction. You gonna help out? No, you just want some food, don't you? Let's go do that. Well, we got that basically shaped up. It's kind of starting to look like a dagger now. Hit the subscribe button, notification bell, and I'll let you know next week when the video drops, which I'm editing here. And we start working on peening the pommel and the guard, attaching them permanently to the dagger, and getting to work on the grip. See you then.